There's a claim that appears online every few months, a claim that immediately sparks arguments, a claim that causes some people to become defensive and causes others to feel triumphant. The claim is simple, that America's first legal slave owner was black. Now, depending on who you ask, that statement is either a hidden historical truth or a misleading oversimplification. But regardless of where you stand, the story behind the claim is fascinating because it forces us to confront something most people don't like to admit. History is often far more complicated than the stories we tell about it. Most Americans imagine slavery beginning with a simple picture: white masters, black slaves, oppressors, and oppressed. And while there is certainly truth in that image, it leaves out an important reality. The early colonies were still developing, the rules were still evolving, the social hierarchy was still taking shape, and during that period, the lines were often far blurrier than most people realize. At the center of this story is a man named Anthony Johnson, a man who began his life in America as an African servant, a man who survived conditions that killed many of the people around him, a man who gained his freedom, built wealth, and eventually found himself at the center of one of the most important legal cases in early American history. A case that historians still discuss nearly 400 years later. So, was America's first legal slave owner black? The answer depends on how we define the question, but the story behind the answer reveals something much bigger than race. It reveals something about power, about incentives, about human nature, about how systems shape the people who live inside of them. To understand why, we would first need to understand the world that Anthony Johnson entered when he arrived in Virginia. To understand Anthony Johnson, we first have to understand Virginia. Not the Virginia we know today, but the Virginia that existed more than 400 years ago. A fragile colony struggling to survive, a place where disease was common, food was scarce, life expectancy was short, and labor was desperately needed. Virginia's economy depended heavily on tobacco, and tobacco required workers, lots of workers. The problem was there weren't enough people willing to do the work, so the colonies turned to several different labor sources. Some workers arrived as indentured servants, others arrived as convicts, some were apprentices, and some arrived from Africa. Now, this is where many modern discussions become confusing because people often project the slavery system of the 1700s and 1800s backward onto the early 1600s. But Virginia in the early 17th century was not yet operating under the fully developed race-based system that would later emerge. That doesn't mean racism didn't exist, and it certainly doesn't mean equality existed, but it does mean the legal categories were still evolving. The rules were still being written. In many cases, Africans and Europeans occupied similar spaces. Both could be servants, Both could complete terms of service. Both could potentially gain freedom. And some Africans did exactly that. They completed their service, acquired property, married, raised families, and became landowners. Now, this reality surprises a lot of people because it doesn't fit neatly into the slavery narrative that most Americans learn in school. But understanding this period is essential because it existed during a transition from one labor system to another, a transition from temporary servitude to permanent hereditary slavery, a transition from status being determined primarily by circumstance to status increasingly being determined by ancestry. And it is precisely during this transition that Anthony Johnson's story unfolds. Because Anthony Johnson did not enter a fully formed slave society. He entered a society that was still deciding what slavery would become. And, as we'll soon see, he would become part of a legal case that many historians view as one of the earliest signs of that transformation. But before Anthony Johnson became a landowner, before he became involved in a courtroom battle, before his name became attached to one of the most controversial stories in early American history, he was simply a man trying to survive. And that story begins in Africa. Like many figures in early American history, Anthony Johnson's early life remains partially hidden by time. We know he was born in Africa. We know he was captured. And we know that sometime in early 17th century, his life changed forever. At some point, Anthony was taken aboard a ship bound for Virginia. The journey across the Atlantic was brutal. Disease was common, death was common, and for many people who entered those ships, the world they knew disappeared forever. When Anthony arrived in Virginia around 1621, he entered a colony struggling simply to survive. Life was hard for almost everybody. Disease swept through settlements, food shortages were common, violence between colonists and native populations remained an ongoing concern, and mortality rates were staggering. In fact, shortly after Anthony arrived, Virginia experienced one of the deadliest events in early history, the Powhatan Uprising of 1622. Hundreds of colonists were killed. The colony itself nearly collapsed. Anthony Johnson survived. Many around him did not. This is something we often forget when looking back at history. Many of those people whose names survive in the historical record survived because they endured circumstances that destroyed countless others. Anthony Johnson was one of those people. He survived disease, he survived instability, he survived a colony where death was often expected, and eventually he survived long enough to gain something that many others never would: his freedom. After completing his period of service, Anthony Johnson became a free man. And this is where his history becomes surprising. Instead of remaining at society's margins, he began to prosper. He acquired land, built a farm, raised livestock, and established himself as a respected property owner. Over time, Anthony Johnson accumulated hundreds of acres of land. He married, raised a family, and built a life that many, at least colonists, regardless of race, could only hope to achieve. By the standards of Colonial Virginia, Anthony Johnson had become successful. Now, pause for a moment and consider how unusual this story sounds. A man captured in Africa, transported across the Atlantic, arrived as a servant, then eventually became a landowner, a taxpayer, a farmer, a member of the colonial economy. This isn't the version of American history most people imagine, but it happened. And it reminds us that history rarely follows the simple categories that we prefer. But success often creates new challenges because once a person acquires land, they need labor. And once a person builds a farm, they need workers. And once property becomes involved, questions of ownership begin to matter a lot. And eventually, one of those questions would lead Anthony Johnson into a courtroom battle involving another African laborer named John Casor. And that case would become one of the most debated legal decisions in early American history, and a case that still sparks controversy nearly 4 centuries later. By the 1650s, Anthony Johnson had accomplished something remarkable. He had survived, he had built wealth, he had established himself as a landowner, and like many landowners in colonial Virginia, he depended on labor because land without workers produced very little. Among the laborers connected to Johnson's property was a man named John Casor. Like Anthony Johnson, Casor was African, and like many laborers in Virginia, his legal status would become the center of a dispute that would eventually reach the courts. Now, the exact details remain debated, but historians generally agree on the central issue. John Casor believed he had completed his period of service. In other words, he believed he should be free. Anthony Johnson disagreed. Johnson argued that Casor belonged to him permanently. And eventually, this disagreement escalated into a legal battle. Now, today, this might sound like a straightforward dispute, but at the time, it was anything but straightforward. Remember, Virginia was still evolving. The legal rules surrounding servitude and slavery were still developing. Many of the categories we take for granted today had not yet been established. The court was operating in uncertain territory. This is one reason historians find the case so important. It occurred during a period where colonial authorities were still deciding how labor systems would function. They were still determining who could be free, who could remain bound, and under what circumstances. And ultimately, the court sided with Anthony Johnson. John Casor was ordered returned to Johnson's service, not temporarily, not for an additional term, for life. This ruling is what makes Anthony Johnson's story so controversial because many historians view this case as one of the earliest examples in English North America of a court legally recognizing permanent servitude for an African. And that distinction matters a lot. This is where the famous claim comes from, the claim that America's first legal slave owner was black. But before we go any further, we need to slow down because history is rarely that simple. And this is exactly where many discussions go off the rails. Some people hear this story and immediately try to use it as a weapon to prove something, to win an argument, to score points in a modern political debate. But the approach misses the larger lesson because the significance of this case is not that Anthony Johnson was black. The significance is that the legal system was changing. And this case helps us to see the change happening in real time. The world that existed when Anthony Johnson arrived in Virginia was not the same world that would exist 50 years later or 100 years later. The racial slave system that most Americans think of when they hear the word slavery was still under construction. And the Casor case sits near one of the earliest foundations. A glimpse at the moment of society was beginning, or when society was beginning to transform labor into something far more permanent, far more hereditary, and eventually far more racial. But this still leaves us with a difficult question, a question that may be even more uncomfortable than historical facts themselves. How does a man who once lived under servitude become a man willing to fight in court to keep another man in servitude? And that question may reveal more about human nature than it does about race. When most people hear the Anthony Johnson story, they immediately focus on race. And that's understandable. Race is the lens through which most Americans have been taught to understand slavery. But Anthony Johnson's story raises another question, a deeper question, a more uncomfortable question. Again, how does a man who lived under servitude become a man willing to fight in court to keep another man in servitude, to keep another man a slave? At first glance, that feels like a contradiction, maybe even hypocrisy. But history is filled with similar examples. Throughout history, people have often opposed systems when they stood at the bottom of them and then defended those same systems once they rose to the top. Not because they were uniquely evil, not because they were uniquely virtuous, but because human beings often adapt to the incentives around them. Think about what Anthony Johnson has spent decades building: his freedom, his land, his farm, his family's future, his economic security. By the time the John Casor dispute emerged, Johnson wasn't simply an African man who had survived hardship. He was also a property owner. He was a businessman. He was a participant in a colonial economy. And once people acquire something valuable, they often begin protecting it, sometimes fiercely, sometimes ruthlessly, regardless of where they started. This isn't unique to Anthony Johnson. It's something we see throughout human history. People frequently identify with whatever role they currently occupy. When they are powerless, they often think like the powerless. When they acquire power, they often begin thinking like those who possess power, which raises an unsettling possibility. Maybe the most important lesson in this story isn't about race at all. Maybe it's about incentives. Maybe it's about what human beings become when a system rewards certain behaviors. And if that's true, then the Johnson story becomes far more difficult to dismiss because it stops being a story about one man and starts becoming a story about all of us. Most people like to believe that they would behave different, that they would have resisted, that they would have stood against injustice, that they would have seen what others could not. Maybe some would have. But history repeatedly shows something else. Most people adapt. Most people learn to operate inside whatever system exists around them, which may be why stories like Anthony Johnson's make us uncomfortable because they challenge a simple narrative. They force us to stop asking who was good, who was bad, and begin asking what incentives existed, what pressures existed, what choices existed, and what would we have done under the same circumstances. Because while Anthony Johnson's story reveals something about human nature, it also reveals something about America, a society that was slowly transforming slaves from a condition into a caste, from a labor arrangement into a racial identity. And understanding that transformation is essential if we want to understand the world that followed. When Anthony Johnson arrived in Virginia, race was important, but ancestry had not yet become an all-encompassing legal category that it would later become. The system was still evolving, the boundaries were still being defined, and colonial lawmakers were still deciding how labor, freedom, and inheritance would function. Over time, those decisions began moving in a very specific direction, a direction that would fundamentally reshape American society. Gradually, the law became connecting African ancestry with permanent servitude, not temporary servitude, not contractual servitude, permanent servitude. One of the most significant developments came in 1662. Virginia adopted a principle known as partus sequitur ventrum. It's a Latin phrase meaning the child follows the condition of the mother. Now, at first, this may sound like an obscure detail, but the consequences were enormous because it meant that if a mother was enslaved, her children would inherit that status, and their children could inherit it as well, generation after generation. At that point, slavery was no longer simply about an individual's circumstances, it became hereditary. It was becoming self-replicating. It was becoming permanent. Over the following decades, additional laws continued to reinforce these distinctions. The categories became more rigid, the opportunities for freedom narrowed, and racial ancestry increasingly became a defining legal characteristic. By the early 1700s, Virginia had become something very different from the colony Anthony Johnson first entered. The labor system had evolved, the legal system had evolved, the racial hierarchy had evolved. What began as a fluid and developing structure had hardened into something far more permanent, far more restrictive, and far more racial. This is why the Anthony Johnson story occupies such an unusual place in history. He existed near the beginning of that transformation, at a moment when the rules were still being written, at a moment when the system had not yet fully become what it would later become. And that makes his story fascinating and difficult to interpret. The deeper lesson isn't that slavery was black or white or African or European. The deeper lesson is that systems evolve, and once they evolve, they begin shaping the people who live inside of them. Sometimes in ways those people never intended, sometimes in ways they never imagined. And that brings us to the final question. Not what happened, not who was right, not who was wrong, but what this story reveals about history, human nature, and ourselves. One reason stories like Anthony Johnson's generate so much attention today is because they challenge modern assumptions. Many people search history looking for simple explanations, but history often refuses to cooperate. The closer we look, the more complexity we find. So, was America's first legal slave owner black? The answer depends on how we define the question. History continues to debate the precise wording. Some argue Anthony Johnson represents one of the earliest legally recognized slave owners in English North America. Others argue the situation was more complicated than that. And they are right to be careful because history deserves precision. The Anthony Johnson story reminds us that systems are powerful. They shape behavior, they create incentives, they reward certain actions, and over time, many people adapt themselves to those incentives, not because they're uniquely good, not because they're uniquely evil, but because they are human. This is one of the most consistent patterns in history. People often criticize systems when they lack power and defend those same systems when they benefit from them. Not always, but often. And that pattern appears across cultures, across nations, across races, across centuries. Which leads us to a question that may be more important than anything Anthony Johnson did, a question that history asks all of us. If you had lived in Colonial Virginia, with the knowledge available at the time, with the opportunities available at the time, with your family's future depending on your decisions, what would you have done? Most people are confident that they know the answer. History suggests otherwise. The story of Anthony Johnson is not a story about proving that race was, or one race was better than another, or worse than another. It's not a story about rewriting history. It's a story about understanding history fully, honestly, without removing the parts that make us uncomfortable. Because when we simplify history, we often miss the truth. And when we miss the truth, we risk misunderstanding ourselves. Anthony Johnson's story reminds us that history is rarely what we expect, and perhaps that's exactly why we should study it.